Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast. I'm Rita Tritcher, Senior Business Writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail. I am very pleased to be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail's headquarters is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. My colleagues and I are very grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. As Canadian businesses face mounting challenges, including the imposition of US tariffs and other geopolitical events, business owners are seeking ways to stay resilient and safeguard their business assets and family wealth. Today, I will be joined by industry leaders as they explore strategies for navigating turbulent times. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to thank and recognize Richter for supporting today's event. Now, let's get started. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who is Paul Jenkins. From 2003 to 2010, Paul served as Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. He was the bank's Chief Operating Officer and a member of its Board of Directors. His duties included overseeing strategic planning, the conduct of monetary policy as a member of the bank's governing council, and participating in fulfilling the bank's responsibilities for promoting financial stability. Paul is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, an independent research institute and think tank focused on economic policy in Canada. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's jump right in. Given all the economic turmoil that Canada faces via the Trump administration,
Indeed.
How should we be viewing risk and uncertainty? And can you offer a framework for how businesses should be thinking about it?
Yeah, let me start by saying, indeed, I think one of the biggest challenges we face, for the reasons you just cited, is decision making under uncertainty. And what I'd like to do is try to provide initially a bit of a macro perspective, if you like, a framework as you call it. And let me start by drawing a distinction between risk and uncertainty. And risk applies to situations where the outcome of a given situation is not known, but where we can, with some degree of confidence, measure the probabilities or odds of an event happening. Uncertainty, in contrast, applies to situations where we cannot know all the information needed to estimate probabilities. In economic jargon, this is what we call radical uncertainty, which is a lack of any quantifiable knowledge about possible occurrences. But let me see if I can put things in a bit of a simpler, non-technical way, and I'm sure our audience and panelists will recall the famous quote by U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, where he said, "There are known knowns, these are things we know. There are known unknowns, there are things that we know we don't know, and then there are also unknown unknowns. These are things we don't know we don't know." And I think much of what we're dealing with south of the border fit into the first two groupings. So, for example, a known would be the erratic behavior of President Trump, which continues to this day. But at the same time, some of the known unknowns would relate to tariffs, and tariffs of what sort, but we're not sure what and for how long. And as well, a known unknown would be related to the negative impacts on the Canadian and global economy. Now, the unknown unknowns, by definition, we don't know these, but if I were to speculate as to what one of those might be in the current circumstances, it could be the possibility of the U.S. wanting to force a global regime change upon us through the upheaval of the global trading system. So one way or another, regardless of how you cut it, it adds up to an almost unprecedented degree of uncertainty. But let me also add, Rita, as part of your question, that there's more than just that going on, and in thinking, we also need to be guided by the fact that today we have two what I call very powerful forces that have been transforming what the future of the global economy will look like, and this well before the Trump chaos. And indeed, many people believe we're living through one of the most revolutionary ages in history. And the first powerful force, I believe, is a changing world economic order driven over the past 3 decades by the rising economic presence of the developing world, especially China, of course. And then most recently, the debacle of the Trump tariff policies, which is the focus of today. But I think we also need to keep these longer trend forces clearly in mind. And the second powerful force is the digital revolution. And here I believe we should be thinking and talking about how best to support the adoption of digital technologies, including AI, to enable Canadian businesses to reskill and upskill our workforce and to develop new products and services, that is, new business models to transform efficiency and productivity. And Canada really does lag far behind many other countries, especially the United States, with the digital economy estimated by the Bank of Canada to account for only 5.5% of GDP. And moreover, research by the C.D. Howe Institute shows that Canada faces serious digital skills shortages that are impacting labor supply, businesses, and affecting economic growth overall. So these are two forces on top of what we're dealing with south of the border that have enormous implications for economic productivity, patterns of economic growth, the nature of work, supply chain configurations, and much, much more. So let me stop there in response to your first question in terms of trying to frame the issues, the distinction between risk and uncertainty, and then the fact that there are other major forces at play facing us in addition to what we're dealing with emanating from south of the border.
Okay, so you started to talk about this in the answer to my first question, but are there any new variables and risks that we should be considering when considering the potential impact on the economy?
Well, I guess I would simply say that uh, and I'm repeating myself here, but it is the additional forces that I think that are at play. But the other element here is trying to understand the type of economic shock that we're dealing with as a result of the type of measures that Trump is taking, particularly we're talking about in the case of tariffs. And if we look back over this century, we've already had two major economic shocks. We've had the global financial crisis of 2008-9, and of course the global pandemic starting in early 2020. And in many respects, both of these can be thought of as cyclical shocks. Cyclical, certainly both having a supply and a demand element, but cyclical in the sense that the economic recovery from the shocks did broadly occur once balance sheets were repaired and economies reopened. The tariff chaos brought about by Trump it's a different type of shock. And here we're talking about a structural shock that may have permanent effects in changing global trading patterns, the status of the US dollar, and global economic governance overall. So if tariffs are long lasting and broad based, there won't be the bounce back that we saw coming out of the global financial crisis or the pandemic. We will, however, certainly regain positive economic growth and hopefully even stronger economic growth than we've had over the last 10 years if they're supported by appropriate policies. But in effect, the level of activity would be lower than it would be otherwise. And indeed, I think if we just were to look at the US, there's a real risk of this structural shock leading to stagflation in the United States of the type that we've not seen since the early 1970s. So let me stop there, and I think that sort of captures the essence of distinguishing between risks and uncertainty, the additional forces that I see at play globally, and then how to think about what we're dealing with in terms of the shock compared to what we went through in the global financial crisis and the pandemic.
I think people would really appreciate your comparison. Thank you about how this current crisis compares to what we've seen in terms of crises in the past. My last question for you, in light of all this, do we need to take a more lateral view
Mm,
of what constitutes risk?
mm. Very good question indeed. And so here, let me try to get a little more granular and to kick it off. Let me circle back and quote Governor Macklin, where he said there are at least two kinds of uncertainty related to U.S. tariffs. There is the uncertainty about the tariffs themselves, which tariffs will actually uh, come to pass and how long they will last. And then, of course, there's the uncertainty about the economic impact of the tariffs. And the implications of both types of uncertainty would include falling consumer and business confidence, concern about jobs and personal financial security, lower business sales and investments, business pricing decisions, weaker demand and economic growth, higher inflation, and financial volatility. Um, and we could also add to this issue I raised earlier about the possibility of a global regime change, whether or not that may be part of the end game of President Trump. And that I do not have an answer to. But with such uncertainty, it is indeed hard to have conviction or calculated probabilities about likely outcomes. Yet we do need to face these challenges head on. And it means that we need to give more consideration to risk management, both idiosyncratic and systemic risks, even if we're talking about situations where there is a lack of sufficient knowledge to quantify risks in any precise way. So, in other words, treating and articulating these uncertainties, these known knowns and known unknowns as risks as best we can. Now, to your question, one way we can do that is in terms of thinking through a range of possible outcomes or scenario analysis, or put differently, planning for different eventualities. And again, if I can draw on some of the work of the Bank of Canada, what they've done in their latest monetary policy report is to use two different U.S. trade policy assumptions, one where tariffs are negotiated away by 2026, and one where tariffs persist. And they do this as a way of framing, and to come back to where we started, framing and gauging risks regarding the economic outlook. So let me conclude, Rita, with two thoughts, which hopefully will also provide a useful lead in to our panel discussion with Sabrina on the trade side, Tasso on the financial, and Hugo on the business, family business side. And the first point is, what happens next to globalization does not depend on the Trump administration alone. The global economy has become multipolar. Other countries are stepping into the game, and these countries are trading with each other and beyond. And the second point is that we can't just be reactionary to these uncertain times. We need to be forward-looking in terms of the forces at play that we do know something about, to put it differently, where we do have a line of sight. And so, for example, on the business side, picking up one of my earlier themes, the digital revolution is not going to go away. So there's a need to invest in the digital economy to bring about efficiencies, new products, and new business models. And secondly, the need to seek out new markets through existing trade agreements, the so-called CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships, and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Europe. These represent market areas where we do need to continue to move towards using our ability to penetrate some of these markets, and of course closer to home through internal trade. So these are areas that where we do have a line of sight, and we can indeed make progress. And for households and individuals, again, embrace the digital revolution in terms of upskilling professionally and personally. And regarding financial investment strategies, I'm sure Tasso will get into this. He's far more an expert in this area. But at times of market volatility, diversification is important. And given the uncertainties and unreliable nature of information, patience and having a medium to longer term time horizon is critical as well, in my view. So let me stop there, and hopefully that provides a bit of a lead in as well to the comments from the panelists.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was very valuable advice. I'd now like to welcome the rest of today's speakers. First up, we have Tasso Legios, Managing Partner of Richter. Next, we have Sabrina A. Bandali, who is a partner and head of international trade and investment at Bennett Jones. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, we have Hugo Germain, Vice President of Operations for Germain Hotels. Welcome all. Thank you all for joining us. This is a really important discussion. And just for the audience, before I get into the panel discussion, I just wanted to mention that during the last 10 minutes of the webcast, we will be answering your questions. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please type them into the virtual Q&A box, and we'll work on answering as many of them as possible toward the end of the webcast. Okay, so just to start, I'd like to hear from each of you, Tasso, Sabrina, and Hugo, a bit more about yourselves as it relates to today's topic. Tasso, why don't you start just offering us a bit of your perspective? How do you think about these issues?
Yeah, so look, the issues are clearly front and center with all our clients. And by way of background, I am a CPA, but for the last 15 years managing Richter. But more importantly, what I've been doing is spending a lot of time with our clients. I sit a lot on some private boards. And the topic of tariffs is obviously front and center. And I would definitely say that it's a highly emotional issue. It has been. So from a human perspective, that's been front and center. Everyone is looking at this and reevaluating their business model, just both short-term and long-term. So it's very topical, definitely in the domain, and as well as how they address some of their business issues, but also some of their wealth issues as well. So we're happy to continue that discussion.
Sabrina, and then Hugo.
Thanks, Rita. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So my name's Sabrina Bandali. I'm a partner at Bennett Jones. We're a full-service law firm with offices across the country, but my practice is based in Toronto, where I'm the national head of our trade and investment protection practice. And so a lot of how I come to these issues is obviously as a practitioner, as a trade lawyer, as a person who gets the phone calls when people are very upset, wanting to know what on earth is happening and what does it mean for their business. And so I advise Canadian companies, international companies, who are looking to navigate the Canadian trade laws that affect either their activity in Canada, bringing goods into the country and doing business here in Canada, or their activity when they're exporting and the Canadian law that applies to their activities abroad, both of which are potentially affected by the tariffs and the uncertainty that's now injected into all of these trading relationships.
Hugo?
Thank you very much, Rita, and thank you for having us. And very proud to represent our family. We own hotels across the country in 7 provinces, 11 cities. And our industry, hospitality industry, is a wonderful industry. And it's also a real-time feedback industry, whereas we constantly have to face uncertainty. It's part of our DNA. So at the end of the day, we as we can recall, whether it be through the pandemic, what we had to go through as far as like demand shifts, opening, closing properties, whether it be impact of interest rates on construction projects or anything like that might impact our decision to move forward on on developing. There are many things that take into consideration, and we need to face in our day-to-day aspect of our operations. And so therefore, I think it's very pertinent to be part of that discussion today and be able to share some of our experience as a family business across the country of beautiful Canada.
Okay, so folks, people in the audience are looking for certainty in uncertain times. Tasso and Sabrina, what are you generally seeing in your respective practices? What types of issues are your clients facing? Maybe Tasso, you can go first.
Sure. So look, as I mentioned earlier, the very first thing we've been dealing with is the highly emotional stress that our clients have been going through. Obviously, this isn't an easy time, and after coming through COVID and feeling that crisis was behind them, here we are again with a crisis situation. Definitely a lot of confusion, a lot of fears, and so on. A lot of our clients are reevaluating things, both short-term and long-term. They're taking a step back, saying, first and foremost, how will this affect our business long-term? I also look at it as parallel tracks, right? You've got to figure out where your business will be long-term, but also what am I going to do immediately? So immediate solutions are obviously on the forefront because people are saying, I need to know how to react to these. What do I need to do on the business side? So we're trying to stay close to our clients. We're trying to talk to them through these issues. Obviously, no silver bullet in this, but obviously always some ways of addressing some of their concerns. For those who have global footprints, they're obviously reevaluating all their options in many ways, looking to see how they can shift, but not so easy to shift on a dime. So they're definitely looking at different areas that they can adjust their business.
Sabrina?
So for a lot of clients, it's, the first question is, what on earth is going on? Just understanding all of the pace of these developments, and then there's an announcement, and then there's a tweet or a truth or whatever they're called now. And people are trying to understand, like, what is real, what is just rhetoric, what is a position, and what is law. And that has not been straightforward, certainly speaking in the US experience. I think in Canada, our government has been making tremendous efforts to try and be clear and to try and put information out there, but it's a fast moving space. And so the number one question that any client is asking right now is what is happening? How does it affect me? And should I be reacting? I think similar to what Tasso was saying, there was sort of an immediate and I agree, a very emotional reaction because the impacts on businesses are profound. We have businesses, industries, supply chains that have really grown up through 40 years of an effort towards regional integration, where we're trying to make it easier and easier for people to do business across borders and to integrate with the United States and then Mexico. And this is a huge disruption in that landscape that has been building in a direction for a long time. And now there's this shock, as Paul talks about it. And so that question about the durability that he brought up is one of those that clients are coming to as well, because on the one hand, they want to put themselves in the best possible position, want to mitigate the risk and the exposure to these tariffs, but they also don't want to be hasty and make big moves that might end up ultimately not being so advisable. And that's certainly what we saw when the U.S. administration, started with, in addition to what has been in place with China for a long time, but started to have tariffs on products of Canada, products of Mexico, with an eye towards incenting businesses to move into and put down greater footprints in the United States. Well, when some weeks later, the reciprocal tariffs were announced, and now all of a sudden the U.S. is in a trade war, not just with its two major trading partners, but with everybody, then the question of, well, where do we go and where is the safe harbor actually becomes quite fraught.
Yeah, I really feel for business owners who are trying to separate the fact from fiction and, trying to use the truth as the basis of making sound business decisions. It's really difficult. Hugo, this is actually a nice lead into a question I have for you. You've got an advantage to a certain extent because more Canadians want to travel domestically, but on the flip side, there's less business travel right now. How are you responding to this shift?
Yes, so I guess to everything, there's always a good side, and historically, I've always been an optimistic guy. So yes, you're right. I mean, obviously, we're noticing, if you're looking at the demand, domestic demand, you're looking at about 60% of Canadians are going to be looking at traveling, whether it be in their provinces or other provinces in the summer to come. As you mentioned, there is a slight, let's say, with the uncertainty comes a little bit of a slowing of corporate demand, which is going to be compensated by the leisure aspect of those guests who are going to be looking to discover the country. Like we've lived in the past, the course of the past couple of years, we've seen this. And that's why, I think one fortunate thing is that our beautiful country is I think, full with beautiful things to see. And it's going to be interesting in the next probably 2 quarters that we're gonna see let's say the slight decrease in corporate demand that's going to be compensated by that leisure demand, and we're going to be adjusting obviously our approach and our offers accordingly. If then you're looking after that to what's coming up for next fall, which when you see that probably leisure is likely going to be slowing down because people are going back to school, finishing their vacation and everything. At this point in time, I think there's going to be an opportunity, Rita, with the business coming from, those retreats, the corporate retreats that were done in other countries like the US, as an example, companies who are doing incentive trips for their employees, whether it be strategic retreats or anything like that. Again, there will be good opportunities, I think, for hoteliers like us to host those activities in their premises in Canada, as we have many things to offer. So I think the outlook for us on that aspect is fairly positive, and we're going to be working really hard to make the most of it.
You're absolutely right. There's lots to see in Canada. I'm hoping that my family will make this the summer that we finally travel to the Gaspésie in Quebec. That's been a dream of mine for quite some time.
Or Charlevoix too. Charlevoix is nice, Rita.
Yes, I've been to Charlevoix already, but yes, you're right. That's wonderful as well. Paul, want to bring you back into the discussion here. What macro signals or indicators should businesses be watching most closely right now when trying to think long term?
Can I pose a question to Hugo?
Oh,
Go ahead, Paul.
Your family business, Hugo, and the hotel sector generally, I want to come back to this issue of the digital revolution, and I'm just curious to the extent to which you've been able to, I'll call it digitize, but gain efficiencies and develop new approaches and products through digital technology, because I really do feel that it's an area where we are lagging in Canada, and we need to do much more. And it seems to me your industry is a very good example of what can be done, and I think what in fact you are doing.
Yes, and Paul, thank you for the question. It's in our industry, it's funny because it's not something we're working towards trying to be as efficient as possible. That being said, at least in our company, it's a human business, and we're dealing with humans traveling, and we want to make sure the contact is always there. But we've done a significant investment in the digital transformation over the course of the past couple of years. We've been very busy to that. The most recent aspect we worked on was the implementation of a very up-to-date CRM, but to make sure that we were able to understand the data, understand our guests, understand where they come from and everything like that, and use it so that we are able to be more precise in the way we're communicating with them. We've done a lot of work also in order to basically remove from our interaction with our guests, making sure that we're removing everything that is not value added. So a good example of that would be, trying to develop the mobile check-in aspect of things so that we can take care of as many things as possible prior to the arrival of our guests, and that after that we can have good quality interactions with our guests if they want to have an interaction. So it's not going like totally towards like being basically contactless in a way. It's being able to offer the choice to our guests to decide what type of opportunity or experience they want to live, and things like automated duplicate management, that we used to do manually. Now we integrated this technology so that we are able to save some time with this. So yes, right now it's something we're investing on. It's mainly in the back end, and some of it obviously is customer facing, but we're very cautious to make sure that through everything we do, you're going to make sure that when you're visiting a Germain or Alt in Canada, we're going to be able to feel that same warm welcome as you walk into the hotel.
Yeah, thank you for that. That I find very, very interesting. And indeed, as you said, the balance on sort of the warmth, personal aspect of it cannot be lost at all. But to your question, Rita, again, I'm going to take a bit of a top-down approach, a more macro approach, and the other panelists may have particular signals that they're looking at, signposts, if you like. But let me start with the idea of the importance of financial markets. Now, financial markets don't always get it right, but they are forward-looking, and I think from that point of view, the need to pay close attention to what financial markets are suggesting. And as an example of that, and this is more of a a negative type comment, but the importance of the movements of U.S. Treasury yields is really quite critical in this situation. And what we saw a week or so ago was a significant backup in U.S. say 10-year Treasuries, which was a very, very significant loss of loss of confidence in what the Trump administration is doing, and with some of the pullback that Sabrina's talked about, still a great deal of uncertainty as to what's going on. But those yields have come back down. So I think financial markets do have a very strong voice in what we're dealing with. So paying attention to what financial markets are doing and saying in a forward-looking context, I think would be one area that I would emphasize. The other aspect, and some of this isn't granular data or necessarily frequent data that we can put our hands on, but I think the notion of what's going on outside the United States, to the extent that we are seeing countries coming together, collaborating, promoting agreements either between two countries or amongst a grouping of countries. I think that changing landscape is also something that one needs to pay close attention to. And the third one, and in a sense, talking my book as a former central banker, but I think inflation is another area that one needs to pay attention to, and not just from the point of view of what's happening to inflation numbers, say here in Canada, but particularly again in the United States. And I say this from the point of view of who is absorbing the cost of these tariff increases, and it is true that tariffs are a tax, and it is true that the proportionate of the impact of the price tariff increases is going to be on American businesses or consumers, individuals, households, and so I think being able to track that is also a particularly important part of what we're doing. This notion of China eating the tariff increases, I just do not see that happening at all. So how these tariffs impact on the U.S. consumer business communities is going to be an important factor in how this all moves forward. So those would be a couple of areas that I would highlight and try to gauge the landscape of a very uncertain situation.
Yeah, those are great points. Certainly the movement in U.S. Treasuries was stunning, to say the least. Tasso, What can business owners do to protect their family wealth as they navigate difficult times for their businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rita. So I would look at it from a few perspectives. The first thing is that as business owners, a lot of our clients have done extremely well by taking a lot of their wealth or leaving a lot of their wealth in the business. And in these times, whether you saw it in COVID or now with tariffs, there is risk in that. So the first thing we do is we spend a lot of time with our clients trying to understand that although we believe in their business, they believe in their business, we believe in their business, we need to evaluate the risk of leaving all their wealth within a business. And to touch on a point that Paul talked about, which is diversification, right? So we encourage our clients to continue to think about their business as a place that they need to continue to invest, but also extract funds from the business and look at investments outside to enhance their diversification. Within that portfolio of assets, what we've gone through is an interesting paradigm over the last year or two where an asset class, public markets have outperformed any other asset class. So what's happened is people have moved into that asset class, but it's also the asset class that has suffered most recently over the last few months because of tariffs. So again, along the themes of diversification is really what's most important, and looking at different asset class, whether alternatives, private equity, other asset classes are definitely an important element. And then a lot of our clients are actually asking us, is there a solution out there during these times? And although the world has been spent the last many decades looking at globalization, globalization has been the direction of most companies, and those are the companies that most people have invested in. But globalization today is not the area it's the area that's most suffered. So the idea is to look at niche investments where globalization is not, and complement their portfolio of assets, looking at more local businesses that are selling in single markets as opposed to markets across, and some niche strategies as well in that as well. So definitely time to reevaluate one's portfolio or their asset allocation across their business and wealth.
Okay, a question for Sabrina. In preparation for today's call, you had mentioned that importing has become much more complicated. And I think you talked about skeletons coming out of the woodwork in terms of the origins of imports. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how companies can navigate this challenge?
Thanks, Rita. Yes. So it picks up on a point that I made a few moments ago, which is that businesses have really structured their operations and how they're doing business based on tariff barriers being low in this move towards regional integration over decades. And so for a lot of companies, for a lot of businesses importing into Canada, they might not have had to have a lot of deep rigor or expertise within the company about customs compliance, about how do you determine the value for duty that then is going to be the base on which a tariff will be charged, or how do you declare the origin of the goods? What is actually the rule? If you buy something from someone in the United States, so the suppliers in the United States, does that mean that when you're importing it into Canada, you say, oh yes, this came from the United States, so it's a US origin good? A lot of businesses might have thought about things more informally or in that kind of not necessarily well-grounded way, because the tariff environment was low, or they were able to claim USMCA and they were CUSMA, and they were able to just kind of proceed. But now, with the retaliatory surtaxes being in place, businesses that might have never paid customs duty in the past are now facing significant duties on top of their products. And so they want to say, well, hang on a second, we've been saying this is US origin. Is it actually? What's the rule? Or they've been saying, well, we just put down the invoice price as the value for duty. Is that right? Or is there a more advantageous way of doing it? So when you start to pick away at that, what you find is these practices that, again, might not have had a huge amount of risk associated with them, but now have real dollar impact. And so we're helping clients and seeing clients find out kind of the standard stuff that you would expect. They need to make different declarations, and maybe that changes the financial analysis for their goods that they import into Canada. But the skeletons that we're talking about are things like, for example, we put down this good as being Russian origin because we bought it from someone in the United States, but we didn't know and didn't think to ask about where the good was actually coming from before that. And as it turns out that now that we start to pull back on the supply chain, maybe this good is coming from somewhere where actually we have concerns from a sanctions perspective or from a forced labor perspective. And so we're getting more, we're finding out more than we knew before. Or maybe it's things like actually maybe not just having increased duties where we now have to file corrections and go back to the border authority, but actually find out that there's risk in our business because our people who we thought were doing these things, or our customs broker that we relied on to do things right, maybe they didn't actually have the full understanding that they should of the rules. And so now we very quickly need to level up and get a lot more sophisticated in understanding. And if I can, there's just one other thing that I want to add to this, because, you know, as I say, a lot of businesses are coming to these issues fresh because of the financial impact of tariffs. But over the last 5 years, this has kind of been the trend, that there's all these things that have been happening, things happening in the world, things happening in the law that are pushing businesses to need to have what some might say is a really burdensome level of transparency, but transparency about their supply chains and their operations. You know, we saw it with COVID when people experienced supply chain disruptions, and all of a sudden it's like, oh no, I need this input. Where am I going to get it from? What are my alternatives? Do I need to just work with the supplier who I've always been working with? And so some businesses started to look at those options then. The Russia sanctions happened, and so people had to ask a lot of questions about, do they know who their business partners really are, and are they doing enough diligence? Last year, we had the Supply Chains Act reporting requirement. Now businesses have to publicly say the things that they're doing to prevent or reduce the risk of forced labor in their supply chain. So we have all of these developments pushing in this direction of saying you must have more information. And I think now, as a result of the tariffs, that trend has become an existential priority for businesses.
That's fascinating. I actually wrote about the transparency clauses built into trade agreements in one of my last columns. So everybody go to globeandmail.com if you want to read up more on that. Sabrina, I just want to stay with you for one more minute. Earlier this month, the government announced a remission program that relieves duties on manufacturing inputs for the next 6 months. Can you tell us more about this program and how businesses can access it?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a time-limited remission that the government has put out. When the retaliatory tariffs were introduced in response to the U.S. actions in March, the government had straight away published a remissions framework that invited individual businesses affected by the tariffs to apply if they thought they had a compelling case to seek remission, which means basically relief. It's relief going forward, so you don't have to pay the tariffs, or backwards-looking refunds if you have, and then you get the benefit of a remission order. And remission is an exceptional remedy. It's meant to be very rarely used. It's a general power that the government has to grant in respect of any duties. So the government was receiving all of these remission applications, and then a couple of weeks ago, they announced this blanket remission program that'll exist for 6 months. It has a few different branches to it, but I think the one that's probably going to be most of interest to many of those joining this webinar will be the one that relates to manufacturing inputs. There are remissions available for certain kinds of entities that are involved in public safety, healthcare, things of that nature. And there are a few specifically named goods in the order, things like formula and other products that are covered by the remission. But most businesses are going to be impacted by the category in the remission order that relates to goods that are imported for use in the manufacturing or processing of another good in Canada, or the packaging of a food or beverage product. And so what that's getting at is direct manufacturing inputs that are being incorporated into manufacture of another good here in Canada. And if you qualify for that, the way to access the remission is by, of course, doing the analysis to make sure that you qualify. And then it's a code that your customs broker can claim when they're doing the entries for you, when they're actually importing the goods for you. So it is a fairly straightforward process. And the reason the government introduced that program was because they said that of all those remission applications that they got, about 60% of them were for this kind of scenario, or were covered by the scopes of scenarios covered by the remission order. And so I think the hope is that this will, at least for the next 6 months, relieve the burden of the surtaxes for a lot of Canadian manufacturers or value-added businesses in Canada that are producing things. But the hope is, and the reason that it's time limited, is to give those businesses time to make the change in their supply chain. And I think that that's a really interesting question, because if the government is thinking that businesses will use those 6 months in that way, I mean, some businesses will be able to, others won't. And so that general idea of a remission framework where businesses make individual applications, that's still there and that's still available. And for companies that, you know, are not going to be able to find a solution within the next 6 months, assuming we still have tariffs in place 6 months from now, obviously all of us hope we won't, but I think there's a chance that there will be some duration to the struggle that we're in at the moment. Businesses will need to think about accessing more a longer standing remission if that 6 months isn't enough for them.
Okay, I can see the audience questions flowing in, and I want to get to as many of them as possible. But before we do, I have a question for Tasso and Hugo. You know, it's really challenging right now for business owners to make any kind of long-term decisions. So I'm hoping you can offer your top piece of advice for people who are listening to today's webcast. Tasso? What is your top piece of advice on this?
Yeah, so look, as I tell many of my clients and business owners, it always is hard during crisis to make long-term decisions. Obviously, you're much more focused on the crisis you find in front of you, but I believe in parallel paths. And although there's things you need to do to address the issues, and there are solutions, or at least ways to address some of them, I believe a business owner needs to address their long-term plan. What is it? How do we see our business continuing into the future with this new paradigm in front of us? You know, how do I expect to continue to grow our business? So assessing the business, having a business plan. Business owners, entrepreneurs are less inclined to have formal business plans, but having something which defines the path forward and their growth into the future, given our new reality, is important and paradigm. So having those discussions with our clients is key in my view.
And Hugo, what is your top piece of advice for business owners who are struggling to make these long-term decisions?
Yes, I think, I mean, for us, one of the silver lining, and I hate to go back to the pandemic, but I think it was probably the best example of a very uncertain time for us. And I think one of the silver lining we had is, first of all, we control what we control. And obviously, there are many things around us that we don't necessarily, we cannot do anything about. But one thing for sure we know is what we've been doing in the past and what we've been good at, and how we can take all of that basically knowledge and experience and try to spin this around so that we can stay relevant, stay pertinent in our particular case, for our guests when things are becoming easier. So that's one of the ways. So control what you control. And the other thing is also making sure that everybody's got stakeholders, key stakeholders, and, you know, whether it be lenders, partners, employees, or anybody. I think it's very important to be communicating transparently. When it's going well, it's going well. And if it's not, you need to make sure that you're communicating on the same level. And that after that, you know, if, as an example, if you have a lender and or lenders that, you know, they need to know exactly if you've been doing some initiatives that might help you be stronger in the future. But they need to know also the hurdles that you're facing on a day-to-day basis, so that when you come out of a crisis, you're not in the red column. You might not be in the green either, but you might be in the yellow, and that might give you a good chance at making sure that you're coming out of it in a good financial position. So to me, those would be kind of high-level advice that I can give from our recent experience. Thank you, Rita.
Okay, Paul, two-part question for you from the audience. The first requires you to go in your time machine and go back in time, and the second part requires you to look through a crystal ball for the future. So the first part of the question is, reflecting back, do you have any thoughts or comments on the Turner-Mulroney debate on free trade in 1988 in the context of today's situation?
Well, I will admit right up front that I'm a true globalist. I do believe that countries grow and prosper by integrating themselves into the global economy. And so I think the debate was, I can recall it vividly, was a great debate, but I think we came out in the right spot. And so I think, we have as a country, we've grown and developed as an open economy, and I think we need to continue to push in that direction. Thus my earlier comments about trying to capitalize on some of the free trade agreements that we currently have and building on those. But clearly, the United States will remain one of our major trading partners, and therefore all the more reason to get this current situation resolved in one form or another, at least resolved in terms of certainty, so that we can go forward and make the types of decisions that Tasso and Hugo and Sabrina are talking about. So no, I am a true believer in global integration, and I think as a country we need to continue to work in that direction.
Okay, and the second part of the question, it's, as I said, requires you to look into your crystal ball and put your Bank of Canada monetary policy hat back on. What are your expectations for interest rates for the balance of 2025?
Let me start out by repeating what our current governor has said, that in the current situation where there is just absolutely so much uncertainty, the idea of giving forward guidance in one form or another, in this case, even more specific guidance in terms of what interest rates might do. I mean, it's a multi-aspect question, multi in the sense that the first part of the question really needs to be thought about in terms of what's going to happen in the United States, because U.S. interest rates do have such an impact on global markets, and there is certainly a tension, and we've seen that recently with comments coming out of the Federal Reserve in terms of their focus on, in a very objective way, on the impact of tariffs on the United States. So I think that's one aspect that one needs to keep a very close eye on, and I'm certainly not seeing any evidence of any near-term decline in U.S. interest rates unless the U.S. were to go into a recession of some sort. On the Canadian side, again, so much of it would depend on, or will depend on, how the economy evolves. The one comment I will make is that I believe we kept interest rates, and this is not just in the Canadian context, but more globally as well. I think we kept interest rates too low for too long, and so we may see some further decline in interest rates if the Canadian economy really does suffer a recession, but I would not think that we would be going back to the world of zero interest rates. I don't think that would be a good planning assumption for businesses or individuals to make. So I'll stop it there. It's not a very clear crystal ball, but I think it does reflect very much the general theme of our discussion, which is the uncertainty and needing to think about that in some sort of a framework within which you can then gauge what some of the risks are and the potential path forward.
So I think I saw you nodding when Paul was talking about not assuming the rates are going to go back to the historically low levels that they were. Is that, did you want to add to that? Is that advice that you're offering to clients?
Yeah, look, I'm not an economist, and but I would say I don't believe that they will go to where they were. I do agree with Paul that directionally, I think we are looking at lower rates as 2025 continues, but there's so many variables to this, and whether it's U.S. interest rates, where we land on tariffs, things like that will dictate that direction. So.
Okay, we have about 6 minutes left, and I'm going to try to get to as many of these audience questions as possible. Sabrina, here's a good question for you. Canada has trade agreements with large markets such as the European Union. How can the government of Canada further encourage trade with these markets? Does this involve expanding trade agreements further, or other solutions required? Because, I've written about this issue too. Canadian businesses have not taken up the opportunities that are to get foreign market access to the extent that they probably should. What needs to be done?
Well, I think it is a different answer for different industries and different businesses, because there are some businesses where it's not that they couldn't access those other markets, but we've had this wonderful access to the US market that has so many people in it, such demand. Why wouldn't you sell to our closest neighbor with whom we have so many connections and where it was easy to do? Now that that relationship is under threat and under challenge, I think there's a greater incentive for businesses to say, okay, yes, maybe we do need to invest in that little bit more. Maybe we need to stretch outside of our comfort zone. That's a business solution. That's not necessarily a government solution, although I think government is making efforts through the Trade Commissioner Service and otherwise to just put more information out there, because I think that's one of the things that really has happened as a result of the landscape that businesses have been operating in, is that where there's been a more straightforward path, it makes sense for operationally businesses to follow it, to try and now stretch themselves in different directions. There's useful things that government can do in terms of just making access to opportunity available, export financing that exists through government mechanisms like Export Development Canada. That's a very important piece of the picture. I think a lot of what government can do to ameliorate the situation is not necessarily through trade agreements, but through other government actions, like we've talked about a lot in the recent election campaign, but also more generally about the need to put down infrastructure to make it easier for goods to transit across the country. Some of that is about pipelines, and people will think about that in terms of our oil and gas industry. But what people don't necessarily realize is if we had the pipelines, then we wouldn't need the rail cars to move certain commodities. The rail cars would be more available to do other things. And so, even solutions that might seem, okay, government's acting for one industry can have knock-on effects with others. The trade agreements are strong and they're good, but businesses need to use them and government needs to support them to get access to information about how to use them.
Okay, so we only have 3 minutes left. I wanted to ask Tasso just really quickly, how realistic is it for Canadian businesses to replace revenue from the US with revenue from Canada, Mexico, UK, European Union? How long would that take?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I don't think we would be replacing the revenue from the US. I mean, they're the closest trading partner. They're the world's biggest economy. I think it goes similar to what I spoke about earlier and what Paul mentioned, which is diversification. I think this is an eye-opener for Canadian businesses to assess their options and say, do I need to sell 100% of my goods, my export goods to a single market? And do I need to start looking at different markets? I don't think it'll be a replacement strategy. It'll be a diversification strategy.
Okay, and Hugo, I want to give you the final word on it's an interesting question for you. You're running your business with your siblings and your cousins. What are the advantages of being a family-run business right now?
Thank you. I mean, it's a very unfortunate, because we're 6 family members working in the company, and I'm fortunate enough to still be working with my father and my aunt and my cousin, my 2 sisters. Obviously, many advantages to be working in such a good environment. We have obviously a lot complementary skills, so not everybody is good at the same thing. So that brings a breadth of knowledge and expertise that we are able to cover in our day-to-day operations. The other thing also is that we are able to cover more ground. So as we are operating across the country, we have more eyes to be able to see what's going on in the hotels and be able to understand and be able to give our feedback and promote the culture also and everything. So that's a chance we have. And obviously one of the last things I can say, maybe because I know we're running out of time, but one of the very important thing about it is that energy level, when we go through times like this of uncertainty, sometimes you have good days, sometimes you have bad days, but there's always somebody who's, stepping up and is able to take the lead. And along with our teams, that I think is a very differentiating aspect about family businesses, is that we're able to go through these difficult times sometimes, but together, and that's an important aspect. So thanks for the question, because I think it's very relevant to discussion today.
Well, thank you so much for ending on a positive note. That gives something for people to hold on to, which is really important right now. Okay, everyone, we are out of time. We're going to have to leave our discussion there. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to thank Paul, Tasso, Sabrina, and Hugo for joining us today and for their great comments. I would also like to thank everyone in the audience for attending and for all your great questions. They were really, really good and on point. And of course, Richter, for supporting today's webcast. Thank you so much. We will be sharing a link to the recorded webcast in about a week's time. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.